It's great to see so many friends, former students, colleagues. These events are really a nice thing to do each year. It's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, the Honorable David Stras. A few biographical facts. David was born on the 4th of July, a true patriot. Offensively in 1974. He's so young, it's ridiculous. He was born in Wichita, Kansas, which calls itself the flight capital of the world. David, while you're here, you need to talk to some of my friends from Dayton about that. He went to University of Kansas for just about everything. He got his BA, his MBA, his JD. So best I can tell, he did everything but, forgive me, play basketball there. But maybe you did play basketball there. How do I know? You seem to have been a trendsetter. I haven't yet asked you about this, but you're one of the first people to have done the 3 clerkship route. So Judge Bernetti, Judge Ludig, and then, of course, Justice Thomas. So I think you started that particular trend. Then David was a law professor at University of Minnesota for, 6 years, 2004 to 2010. And then, very warm to my heart, on the Minnesota Supreme Court for 8 years. Why you left that job, I'll never understand. How I can get that job is what I want to know. And he's been on the 8th Circuit since 2018 and very quickly became an intellectual leader on the court and across the federal judiciary. I've known David, I think, for about 15 years. I think we met at a symposium at your alma mater, Kansas, with our friend Steve McAllister to talk, of course, about state constitutions. And then at my urging, I've gotten David coming once a year to NYU. They have a new program for new appellate judges every year, and David's a perfect instructor for that. So what kind of judge is David? Well, let me start with his words, brief words in one opinion, a case called Cunningham. It's one of my favorite dissents of all time. The reason is that it's just 5 words, really only 3 count. It's, I dissent, period, more to come. Which is really a lovely thing to say, because how can you ever say when you haven't finished that obligation? It's actually a Second Amendment case. The majority held that there wasn't a Second Amendment problem with this felon in possession federal statute, and my suspicion is there really is more to come. It's a fairly recent decision, so we'll see where that goes. The other case that I wanted to mention was a case called Saxton. It's a case about a big federal agency. I haven't talked to David about this, but I suspect he has some skepticism about some of our federal agencies. But in that case, the majority said the statute controlled things, and David described his vote. He ultimately concurred, and he described his vote this way. The plaintiffs make a compelling case that the federal agency has grown into a monster. But judges are not superheroes. We cannot run to the rescue every time danger looms. Our job is to follow the law wherever it leads. And I must say, David, that has defined your career. You're a worthy heir of Justice Thomas in that respect. The only thing I'll add to it is just a reminder I got from my mentor on the 6th Circuit, David Nelson, and unfortunately he gave me this advice too late. It was just after I'd been confirmed and sworn in by him, and he said, you know, Jeff, I might have told you this earlier, but this is actually a pretty hard job. And I remember thinking, really? I mean, I'm going to take a reduction in pay, and I had always thought, how hard can it be, right? There are right answers to every legal problem, just work hard enough and you'll figure it out. Well, 21 years later, I'm afraid David Nelson was right. This is a hard job. It's not just enough to say you're going to follow the law wherever it leads. In fact, proof that I'm perhaps getting too old for the job, I've come to think of it as just like raising children. It's never going to work out, but the thing you got to do is just keep trying. And so that is the sad state of affairs in my life as a judge. I don't think David's gotten there yet, but I promise you he will always put the effort in, and he will be trying to find that right answer. And it's not easy to fly all the way from Minnesota to Ohio, so we are so grateful to have you here. I guess you didn't fly through Wichita, but you're near Dayton, and we're honored that you're here and can't wait to hear from you. And I should point out one other thing. I tried to get him to talk about state constitutions. He said, enough is enough, we're not doing that. I'm going with the First Amendment. But on this particular talk, David just returned from Israel, about 20 federal judges. So he's got a few things to say about things contemporaneously there and about his grandparents' experience. So thank you, David.
Wow. So we often say that was a kind introduction, and usually I mean it, but this time I really mean it. That was a very kind introduction by Jeff, and I consider him to be a longtime friend, and I appreciate him introducing me. I also appreciate being invited. Robert Alt called me and said, hey, you want to come to Ohio? And I wasn't going to say no, and so I appreciate his invitation. I appreciate Lisa for setting everything up. It's really my distinct pleasure to be here. So let me contemporary events make this speech different than maybe when it was written. And I know you haven't heard it yet, but I want to give you a little bit of a preview about how things have changed. I wrote this probably about 4 years ago. I've given other versions of it, but it was the first time I focused on the First Amendment. And one of the reasons why I wrote the speech is because I started seeing what was going on at colleges and universities, and even one of my sons was in junior high at the time. It even reached middle schools and high schools as well. I was concerned about how our young people view the First Amendment and may not take it quite as seriously as we do. That was the impetus for writing the speech in the first place. So Jeff mentioned this. I went to Israel it was 15 of us total. It was about 3 to 4 weeks ago. It was one of the most eye-opening experiences of my life. We met with a number of members of the military in Israel. We met with Israeli leaders. We met with a Palestinian leader. We went and looked at a kibbutz and one that had been attacked on October 7th. We also went to the site of the music festival where a group of folks from the United States actually spontaneously broke into song while we were there, which was very moving. It was a fascinating experience. It was a great experience. Probably the worst part of the visit was we watched that now well-known 47-minute video made up of Hamas body cam video and other video, like surveillance video. It was the most horrifying thing I have ever watched in my life. And if you see it, you can't help but have what you saw seared into your brain. And I'm happy to answer questions about it. It's too graphic to even talk about during lunch, to be honest with you. But it's something that I've been thinking about very deeply over the past few weeks. There's also another element of what's going on right now. And that's why I think this speech is particularly appropriate and timely now. The rise of anti-Semitism. It was always sort of in plain view. I knew it existed. A lot of my friends thought it was gone, that we had moved past that. I knew when I ran for election in 2012 in Minnesota, I got some questions as I went around the state that were sort of the ignorant form of anti-Semitism, like people not understanding. For instance, I got a question that said, you're Jewish, correct? And I said, yes. And they said, well, how can you serve on the Minnesota Supreme Court then? And it was ignorance, because she later clarified it was, you don't work on Saturdays, so how can you do your job on Saturday? And so I obviously corrected that. But now we have a more virulent form of anti-Semitism. It's on every college campus virtually in the United States. One of the things that's most striking about this time period is that it is now socially accepted to be anti-Semitic. Like I've had things said to me. There's skyways in Minnesota. I've had things said to me because I'm not famous, but I'm recognizable because I ran for statewide election, and I've been and I had a very public confirmation. And I've had things said to me in the skyways that are quite unfortunate and probably anti-Semitic. People have no qualms about doing it today because they feel justified. So that's different. So now really we have two things. At first I saw speech sort of dwindling away, but now we also have the rise of anti-Semitism as well. So somehow, some way, and again, I know you haven't heard this speech is more timely now than it was when I wrote it, which was 4 years ago. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about what is easily sort of the most virulent form of anti-Semitism that has ever existed, and I hope our society never sees that again. It does have me worried where we are now, that maybe we will, but hopefully we don't. So the topic of the speech hits pretty close to home for me. As the title suggests, my grandparents on my father's side were Holocaust survivors. I'm fortunate to have their personal records, which tell the story of their lives, from their hardships to their liberation to their life after liberation. Their stories and example have shaped me in many ways, perhaps even in ways I cannot fully appreciate. I've come to realize that their stories have done more than just shape me personally. They have become a part of who I am and how I view the world around me. To a certain extent, they have also shaped my judging too, and why I hold so firmly to first principles, those core beliefs that shape how I approach the law. One example is the First Amendment, and in particular, its part in guaranteeing a free society. Years before I ever studied the freedom of speech or the free exercise of religion in law school, I learned about those concepts, at least abstractly, from my grandparents. My grandparents, Walter and Malvina Stras, were lucky to survive. They met for the first time in a liberation camp in Germany and were married soon thereafter. Although they originally planned to move to Israel, they ended up, in all places, Kansas City. My grandmother, born Malvina Nyman, grew up in Hungary as one of 7 children. Her family was devout. She spoke fondly of the rich traditions of the Jewish faith that were part of her early life, as well as the custom of speaking Yiddish at home, and I heard some of that as I was growing up. Her relatively peaceful childhood, however, was violently torn apart at the age of 18, when Nazi soldiers dragged my grandmother and her family from their home. At gunpoint, they were forced to walk all day to a cattle train, which transported them to Auschwitz. Of her family, most of whom I never knew, only 3 of her sisters survived. Although fortunate that she did not perish too, my grandmother suffered unspeakable harms that left her reluctant to share her experiences. Loss of family members, vicious beatings that led to permanent blindness in one eye, and verbal attacks. She was frequently called a damned Jew. All contributed to lifelong depression and a hesitancy to speak about what she experienced in the concentration camps. Despite spending the better part of several summers with her as a child, I cannot say that I really ever knew much about her other than her post-Holocaust life. My grandfather was different. He shared his thoughts on his life and the Holocaust in particular with anyone who would listen, especially towards the end of his life. For that reason, I'm going to focus in particular on his story. My grandfather, Walter Stras, was young when he was shipped off to the camps. Born in 1924, he was first sent to a labor camp and then to Auschwitz in 1943 at the age of 19. He was one of too few to survive. He passed away in 1995 after I had known him for only 2 decades, but the lessons from his life shaped me to this very day. I didn't fully realize his impact or truly understand his suffering until many years after his death. In a way, this journey into his life is my way of honoring him. My first memories of my grandfather were from a young age. I grew up knowing him as a survivor, watching how he lived his life after liberation. By the time I came into the world, he was already afflicted with multiple sclerosis, a disease that took away his ability to walk, to write, and to take care of himself. Despite all he had seen and endured, he was a great and giving man who never complained. Rather than turning inward, he turned towards others in his life. He made a lasting impression on everyone he met, particularly in his efforts to reach out to and work on behalf of other Holocaust survivors. He once said, "Encouraging words from other survivors have made it possible for me to speak. For the ones who did not survive, the ones who died after liberation, and the ones who are unable to speak for themselves." For him, telling his story was never easy. Despite liberation in 1945, it was not until the mid-1970s that my grandfather was able to speak about his experiences. And even then, he rarely did so to us, his grandchildren. He likely feared that the horrors of his own life would somehow jade ours. Speaking in 1979, he observed, "Only in the last 3 or 4 years have I been able to get the courage to speak up. For many years, the feeling that you were not allowed to speak during imprisonment stayed with me, and I'm sure many other survivors share that feeling. We are crippled emotionally as a result of what we had to go through. We try, and we must keep on fighting, even though it is so difficult to do." It is, of course, no exaggeration to say that those imprisoned in Nazi Germany were not allowed to speak. Yet even years before my grandfather's imprisonment, my grandfather and others like him were forced to wear a yellow Mogen David, the star with the name Jude on it. The Nazis restricted where he could travel and censored his mail. He could not send anything to foreign countries, and the government read everything coming from the outside. One time, after intercepting his mail, the Gestapo questioned my grandfather, who recalled that he was happy to get out of the Gestapo building alive because the Gestapo was tremendously harsh on anybody. It didn't have to be a Jewish person. Anyone who was opposed to the Nazi regime would be punished. It is fair to say that before he actually became a prisoner, he was effectively a prisoner in his own country, stripped of his right to speak. Once he arrived at the camps, as one might imagine, things only got worse. Prisoners were forced to remove all their clothing, sit as barbers sheared their hair, and watch as numbers were tattooed on their forearms. Then the guards made them work. My grandfather recalled, "While marching, all of a sudden, I saw one guard step close to a prisoner, pull the cap from his head, and throw it about 20 feet away. The prisoner, who had to have his cap, jumped out of line to retrieve it. A gunshot followed. The prisoner was killed. What for? Because he had stepped out of line. Because this guard was a barbarian who did not care if he shot 1 or if he shot 10. It was right for him to kill. It was right for him to destroy other human beings." Despite witnessing and experiencing some of the cruelest acts imaginable during his time at Auschwitz, my grandfather continued to see the best in people, not the worst. In fact, he thought that decency and compassion could be found in even the most horrific conditions. He relayed stories about the repeated acts of kindness that spared his life, acts committed by fellow prisoners in the concentration camps who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. One particularly moving story involved his interactions with the nurses in the camp hospital. Now understand, that is a cruelly ironic description because many who visited the hospital never made it out alive. Its purpose was to separate the weak from the strong and to make sure that only the strong returned to work. As one might expect, my grandfather became frail and malnourished during his time in Auschwitz. The camp's policy was that no patient was worth keeping around for more than 2 weeks. The prisoner nurses knew that he could not recover so quickly, which meant certain death for him, so they risked their own lives to save his. They moved him from room to room and falsified hospital records. These acts of kindness, which came at great risk to the nurses, spared my grandfather. He recalled the story in his own words. After about 2 weeks, I was told all of a sudden, you're going to be released today, even though you are still too sick. But don't worry, you will be released just on paper. You will not leave the hospital here. I will try to keep you as long as possible until you are well again. I was moved to a different room. I did not know why at the time, but I was told to just keep quiet. In another example of humanity in the midst of darkness, he told the story of 3 of his fellow prisoners, 3 dear friends of his, who tried to escape from Auschwitz. My grandfather assisted in their plan, which included the camp electrician, a fellow prisoner. The prisoner electrician would short out a portion of the electric fence around the camp, and in that moment, his friends would escape. My grandfather, who provided them with stolen civilian clothes to wear after the escape, was privy to the plan because he was asked to go with them. However, as a non-Polish speaking prisoner, he knew that he would be unable to avoid detection outside the fences. So he stayed behind as his 3 friends carried out their plan. In a cruel act of betrayal, the prisoner electrician revealed the plan to the guards, not knowing of my grandfather's role. When his friends were caught and hanged as punishment, they could have admitted my grandfather's involvement. Instead, they kept it a secret. As he watched his friends pay the ultimate price, my grandfather never forgot their deep loyalty, which had saved his life. To put the rest of it in my grandfather's words, on a Sunday afternoon, my 3 friends were hanged on the gallows erected in the middle of camp, a place where every morning thousands of prisoners stood at attention for roll call prior to going to work. As part of my work, I took my dear friends down from the gallows, knowing that they had not betrayed me. They had kept their word, and I had survived. Deprived of his ability to speak during his formative years, my grandfather made it his life's mission to share his story. The difficult and extremely painful lessons that it conveys are part of why it is so important for other people to hear it. As I grew up, I realized that my grandfather was someone who had strong beliefs and would not back down in the face of adversity. As my colleagues, both past and present, will attest, he passed that trait on to me. One example comes from my Supreme Court clerkship. I disagreed at the time with a position taken by Justice Thomas. Now, I can't tell you what the case was about, can't tell you the case name because I still owe a duty of confidentiality to him and to the court all these years later. But here's what I can tell you. I spent more than 30 minutes in his office trying to persuade him to think about an issue just a little bit differently. Now, think about that. I was just 28 years old, 4 years removed from law school, as many clerks are, and I was telling a then 11-year veteran of the United States Supreme Court to reconsider his views. As those who know Justice Thomas might suspect, I did not persuade him. In fact, he told me at the conclusion of our discussion that I had convinced him that his own views in the case were correct. But advocating for my beliefs was still the right thing to do. Why? Justice Thomas taught me a lesson that day by showing me that he respected my willingness to express my sincerely held views and to stand up for my beliefs, even if I was the only one holding them. The lesson echoed one that I had learned years earlier from my grandfather, and that is as follows: defending your beliefs, no matter how unpopular they may be, is always the right thing to do. There was another lesson in that experience, too. Justice Thomas listened closely to my views, even though I suspect that he was already firmly set in his own. My grandfather taught me that as well. As important as it is to defend your beliefs, it is equally important to hear and to listen to what other people have to say. These lessons stick with me today, and they inform my understanding of what the freedom of speech means. The Supreme Court has long held that the First Amendment protects the right to receive information and ideas. The Nazi regime, of course, was fundamentally opposed to any ideas other than the ones that they endorsed. It restricted speech in every way possible, from compelling Jews to wear the yellow Mogen David on their clothes to punishing citizens for saying anything critical of the government or its leaders. Even the mere threat of nonconforming speech was enough, or else my grandfather would have never been pulled in by the Gestapo to explain his simple act of sending mail. It is nothing short of remarkable that after experiencing widespread and systematic suppression, my grandfather became such an avid and curious listener. Once he came to America, my grandfather sought out the community of other Holocaust survivors. Among his greatest accomplishments was working on behalf of other survivors, including successfully obtaining financial assistance from the German government and speaking at memorial events to remind survivors that their voices mattered. Perhaps most importantly, he constantly reminded fellow survivors how important it was to be proud of being Jewish. His stories remind me that my own Jewish heritage and faith are an integral part of who I am. And fortunately for me, the country that I've had the privilege to grow up in has protected the exercise of my Jewish faith, again by virtue of the First Amendment. I feel blessed that I, unlike my grandparents, have never had to choose between my religion and my life. Perhaps it's no accident that my grandparents ended up here. America has always been a religious refuge. From the early settlers onward, people have come to America to escape religious persecution. The Constitution reflects this tradition. Consider what the First Amendment tells us about what it means to be an individual. Unlike what my grandparents experienced in Nazi Germany, no one in this country is just a number, with or without a tattoo. Our values may be different, our beliefs worlds apart, and still the government has no right to tell us what to say or what to believe. Importantly, we are allowed, but we are not forced to wear those beliefs on our sleeves. We can speak about them, we can pray about them, and even associate with others who have the same beliefs. Again, all under the umbrella of the First Amendment. These ideas could not be more fundamentally at odds with how the Nazis treated my grandparents. During their time in the concentration camps, their captors made every effort to erase all evidence of their humanity. They tattooed numbers on their arms and took away their names, their belongings, and their clothes. They were told that they were Jews and nothing more, but they could never act like one. Luckily for my grandfather, he was able to maintain his own sense of identity despite the best efforts of his captors. He always remembered the importance of maintaining connections to community, identity, and to religion. Even through my grandfather's most difficult days, he never forgot who he was or the community to which he belonged. So what does any of this have to do with judging or being a lawyer? To start, his experiences remind me about the wisdom of our Constitution, from setting out enumerated rights to protecting those rights through the separation of powers, with each branch serving as a check on the others. It also brings into sharp focus the importance of the rule of law. In large part, the evils of the Holocaust were a result of the personal views of just a few powerful individuals, those who were able to use the law and the legal system to achieve the ends that they desired. It was instructive, though extraordinarily difficult, as you might imagine, when I decided in high school to do a book report on Mein Kampf, the book penned by Adolf Hitler. My goal was to better understand my family, my history, and what motivated the horrors of the Holocaust. It was in reading that book that I realized how a single person or a single movement, if left unchecked and unaccountable, can pervert the rule of law. If those in power can lead with their own sense of what is right, without the constraints of the rule of law, then our most important institutions can become co-opted and vital safeguards in society eliminated. The danger is never too far away, and we always have to be vigilant about making sure that our freedoms are not whittled away. One case from my time on the Minnesota Supreme Court stands as an example. In a case called State versus Crowley, the question was whether the state could criminalize the making of knowing false statements about police misconduct that were made to other police officers. Now that may sound innocent enough, and the policy sounds like the right one. But I noted in my dissent that it came close to prohibiting the very type of speech protected by the First Amendment, speech critical of the government. And it did so by attaching a criminal sanction, likely deterring many citizens from making any reports about police misconduct, true or otherwise. First Amendment doctrine, as you may recall from law school, calls this the chilling effect. Of course, lingering in the back of my mind was the simple fact that the Nazi regime made it a point of defining truth and falsehood too, leaving few willing to speak. Another case is Telescope Media versus Lucero, which involved a couple who produced wedding videos through a family-owned business. They wanted their videos to promote a certain message celebrating marriage as a sacrificial covenant between one man and one woman. For that reason, the couple was unwilling to produce wedding videos for same-sex weddings. The problem for them was that a Minnesota anti-discrimination statute said that if they wanted to produce any wedding videos at all, they had to provide them to everybody, no matter what message they were trying to convey. On behalf of the court, I authored a majority opinion holding that the message they were trying to express through their videos was protected First Amendment expression, no matter how unpopular their views may be. Minnesota's law, in turn, was a form of compelled speech because it required the couple to speak favorably about same-sex marriage once they made the decision to speak favorably about opposite-sex marriage. The point is, and this is important, if we decide that government can prohibit offensive speech, then speech is not really free anymore. It would surprise no one that to this very day, I am still personally offended by the decision made by the Supreme Court in the 1970s to allow neo-Nazis to march through a Chicago suburb filled with Jewish residents. But that's not the point. As the Supreme Court has put it, the bedrock principle of free speech is that the government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds the idea itself offensive or disagreeable. I'm worried, especially now, that this principle gets lost today. It's also a right that we enjoy. It is not a right that my grandparents had. As my grandfather said of his experience at Auschwitz, I saw then what concentration camps meant, the destruction of the human being, of his dignity, of his self-esteem, of his confidence, of his beliefs in God, of his beliefs in his fellow man. In wrapping up, I want to let my grandfather's words again speak for themselves. This is always the hardest part of the speech. My grandfather was addressing a group of new American citizens at the New American Club in Kansas City on April 22nd, 1979, nearly 40 years ago. I'm sitting before you in my wheelchair, the lifeline for my daily independence, disabled from the after effects of malnutrition and mental stress during the times that I was a slave laborer and prisoner in labor in the concentration camps. I sit before you with extreme physical and emotional pain. With all of my handicaps, I am humble and thankful that I'm able to be here and represent those who cannot be here. You who came here because you do care about your fellow man should listen. Spread my words around. The people who are here should know that there's a spokesman who knows what it means to survive, who cannot forget his sufferings, and who knows the sufferings of the survivors who cannot speak for themselves. I was transported in a freight car, unknowing my destination to Auschwitz. I was then taken in an open truck to Auschwitz-Buna, the IG Farben chemical complex, part of the camp. I remember being stripped naked of civilian cloth running through a cold April rain. I remember shivering not only from the cold, but from the fear of what would happen next. A prisoner tattooing the number 117022 on my left forearm. Suddenly, I didn't have a name anymore. I was just a number. But even with no name, I still knew who I was. I still had my identity. I still knew about my upbringing, my roots. I was so young, just a teenager. Already in my young years, I had already experienced a life that most people never experience in a lifetime, much less survive. At the time, I really could not comprehend that I would die. I probably didn't even understand what death meant because I was so young. I had not lived enough. I had survived. Liberation, what did it mean for us? You try to find members of your family, but you know they're not coming back. You immigrate to new and other countries, new surroundings, new language, new customs. You find a job, you work hard to support yourself and your new family. You get accustomed to your new country, a free human being. Suddenly, your thoughts come back to a time when you were subjected to inhuman treatment. The joy of freedom and liberation somehow gets lost with your own inner feelings. Something is wrong with me. You question yourself, why did I survive? Why? All of a sudden, life is a struggle again. Who can you complain to? Maybe no one wants to believe that we are suffering from the after effects of the Holocaust. Some people believe us, but not the ones who are responsible for it. Right now, we are still fighting for the damage done to us, for our rights. I'm speaking the facts and the truth for many survivors. We, the survivors, have to let the world know that we will never again allow another Holocaust. All of you here in this room, may I call you my friends, we must speak up and let the world know that we are proud of our heritage. These words encapsulate my grandfather's spirit, not only because he survived the most unspeakable of tragedies, but because of who he became and what he taught me. It is important that we never forget those words, never again, but that we also never forget what people like my grandparents endured and the lessons that we can learn from them. Grandpa, I remember, and I will never forget. Thank you.